the gilded cage of Ethelgard Heights, where old money whispered and new money screamed, one name silenced them all: Victoria Blackwood. She wasn't just a millionaire's wife. She was the city's self-appointed queen, ruling her court from the corner booth of the world's most exclusive restaurant. Her words were venom wrapped in silk, her gaze a shard of ice. For years, everyone from society dames to seasoned staff bowed to her will, fearing the social and financial ruin she could unleash with a single dismissive wave. They all knew the rules, until a new waitress arrived who didn't. This is the story of how a 24-year-old woman with nothing but student debt and an unbreakable will didn't just stand up to Victoria Blackwood. She made her look utterly devastatingly ridiculous. The Gilded Sparrow wasn't merely a restaurant, it was a theatre, tucked away on a cobblestone street in the city's most affluent district. It operated on a currency far more valuable than the dollars listed on its hand-calligraphed menus. The currency was influence, and the house bank was run by its clientele. The chandeliers, dripping with Austrian crystals, seemed to cast judgment rather than light. The velvet banquettes absorbed secrets, and the air itself, thick with the scent of white truffle and ambition, felt heavy with unspoken rules. Into this world walked Elara Vance. At 24, she possessed a quiet intensity that was often mistaken for naivete. Her resume said she was a student saving up for her final year of law school. Her eyes, however, a startlingly clear shade of grey, told a different story. They were the eyes of an observer, someone who saw not just what was happening, but why. She needed this job. The tips at a place like the Gilded Sparrow could clear her tuition debt in 6 months, a goal that felt both impossibly close and terrifyingly distant. Her trainer, a kind, world-weary waiter named Leo, who had worked there for 15 years, gave her the tour, not by showing her the floor plan, but by outlining its power dynamics. Table 7, the Goldsteins. He's in finance. They're loud, but they tip 30%. Be nice, he murmured, polishing a wine glass until it squeaked. Table 12, the mayor's advisor, Mr. Phillips. He never looks you in the eye, and he'll try to get you to comp his dessert. Don't. He paused as they approached the most coveted table in the restaurant, a plush, semicircular booth in the corner that offered a panoramic view of the entire room, while affording its occupants a measure of privacy. And this, Leo said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, is Table 1. Her throne. Elara didn't need to ask who her was. She had already heard the stories, the hushed warnings in the staff kitchen. Victoria Blackwood, wife of Julian Blackwood, the real estate magnate whose name was plastered on half the city's skyscrapers. But Julian was a ghost, a name in the papers. Victoria was the flesh and blood deity of their world, and she was a vengeful one. She comes in Tuesday and Thursday nights, like clockwork, Leo continued. She always arrives at 7:30 p.m. on the dot. She requires a bottle of Sancerre Domaine Vacheron, chilled to precisely 8°C, to be opened tableside the moment she sits. Not before, not after. Her steak is to be cooked medium rare with a cool red center. If it has a warm pink center, she will send it back and have the cost of the entire meal deducted from the chef's salary. Elara felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Is that legal? Leo offered a sad smile. Is it legal for her husband to call our owner and threaten to pull the Blackwood Corporation's multi-million-dollar account from his investment portfolio? She doesn't need rules, Elara. She makes them. Elara's first Tuesday night felt like waiting for a hurricane. The entire staff was on edge. The chefs double-checked their mise en place. The host, a man named Marcus, who usually oozed unflappable charm, kept nervously adjusting his tie. At 7:29 p.m., a hush fell over the dining room. At 7:30 p.m. precisely, the heavy oak doors swung open. Victoria Blackwood swept in. She was a masterpiece of cold, calculated beauty. A severe black dress by Tom Ford, a single blinding diamond necklace, and dark hair pulled back into a chignon so tight it seemed to stretch the skin over her razor-sharp cheekbones. She didn't walk. She glided her eyes, scanning the room, with an air of profound disappointment, as if the very existence of other people was a personal affront. Her gaze landed on a nearby table, where a young couple clearly celebrating an anniversary were laughing. Victoria's lip curled in a barely perceptible sneer. She paused by their table. "A bit loud, don't you think?" she said, her voice a low, melodic poison. It wasn't a question. The couple's laughter died instantly. The young man's face flushed with crimson. "Our apologies, Mrs. Blackwood." She ignored him, already moving towards her table. Marcus rushed forward to pull out her chair. From her station, Ilara watched the scene unfold. She saw the couple's ruined evening, the fear in Marcus's eyes, the way every other patron in the room suddenly lowered their voices and focused intently on their plates. This wasn't respect. This was terror. That night, Victoria was in another server's section. Ilara watched from afar as the poor man, a new hire named David, trembled while pouring her son Sarah. She found a flaw, of course. Condensation. Victoria announced loud enough for the tables around her to hear. She ran a perfectly manicured finger down the side of the bottle. "Do you not understand basic physics? The bottle is too cold. It's shocking, the wine. Take it away, and bring me one that has been handled by an adult." David, pale and stammering, scurried away with the offending bottle. Leo intercepted him in the kitchen, patting him on the back. "Don't worry, son. It's a rite of passage. She just needs to mark her territory." But Ilara saw it differently. She saw a bully who fed on the humiliation of others, and deep down in the part of her that was studying contract law and torts, the part of her that believed in justice and fairness, a quiet, dangerous thought began to form. This wasn't right, and someone someday would have to make it right. 2 weeks later, the inevitable happened. It was a Thursday, and the server assigned to table 1 called in sick with a sudden, suspiciously diplomatic case of food poisoning. The restaurant manager, Mr. Dubois, a man whose spine seemed to dissolve in Victoria Blackwood's presence, scanned his remaining staff with the frantic energy of a man choosing his own executioner. His eyes landed on Ilara. "Vance," he said, his voice tight. "You're up." Leo gave her a look of profound sympathy from across the room. "Remember what I told you," he mouthed. "Breathe, and don't make eye contact unless she speaks to you." Ilara's heart began to hammer against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the cathedral-like silence of her focus. She wasn't afraid of hard work or demanding customers. But Victoria wasn't a customer. She was a predator, and Ilara was walking into her hunting ground. She took a steadying breath, straightened her apron, and reminded herself of her goal law school. This woman was just a temporary, albeit terrifying, obstacle. At 7:30 p.m., Victoria arrived. Tonight she was in a winter-white pantsuit, a stark, angelic contrast to her demonic reputation. Ilara approached the table, the pre-chilled Sancerre and a polished corkscrew on a small silver tray. "Good evening, Mrs. Blackwood," Ilara said, her voice even and calm. She kept her eyes focused on the bottle. Victoria didn't reply. She simply watched her sharp blue eyes, missing nothing. The silence was a physical weight. Ilara could feel the eyes of Mr. Dubois Leo, and half the dining room on her back. She expertly sliced the foil, inserted the corkscrew with a quiet precision, and eased the cork out without a sound. It was a perfect extraction. She poured a small tasting amount into Victoria's glass. Victoria stared at the glass for a long moment before picking it up. She didn't swirl or sniff. She simply took a sip, her expression unreadable. She held the wine in her mouth for a few seconds before swallowing. Marginally acceptable, she finally declared. The entire restaurant seemed to exhale. Ilara proceeded to pour the wine to the correct level and placed the bottle in the silver ice bucket beside the table. "Will you be having your usual, the filet mignon?" Now Victoria said, a flicker of something annoyance, surprise in her eyes. She had expected pure subservience. "I find myself in the mood for the Dover sole." Meunier. "But I want it filleted tableside, and I expect it to be done flawlessly. The last time someone attempted it, it looked like it had been savaged by a wild animal. It was a test, a difficult theatrical and public test. Tableside filleting was a dying art, a skill most modern servers didn't possess. But Ilara had spent her first week at the Gilded Sparrow, studying not just the menu, but the restaurant's old service manuals. She knew the theory. "Of course, Mrs. Blackwood," she said, without missing a beat. When the sole arrived on its silver platter, Ilara approached with the gueridon the small tableside service cart. A hush fell over the nearby tables. This was dinner and a show. With delicate, practiced movements, she made a precise incision down the spine of the fish. Using a fish fork and spoon, she began to lift the top fillet, clean and whole. Her hands were steady, her focus absolute. It was like performing surgery under a spotlight. Victoria watched her, her head cocked to one side. She was looking for a mistake, a tremor, a moment of hesitation. She found none. Ilara cleanly removed the two top fillets, then gently lifted the central bone in one single, elegant piece, setting it aside. She plated the pristine fillets, spooned over the sizzling brown butter with capers and lemon, and garnished it with fresh parsley. It was perfect, a textbook execution. "Your Dover sole, Mrs. Blackwood Ilara," said, placing the plate before her. Victoria stared at the plate. For the first time that evening, her mask of icy disdain seemed to crack, revealing a sliver of grudging respect. It was gone as quickly as it appeared. "We'll see if it tastes as good as it looks." She sniffed, but there was no venom in it. The test had been passed. For the rest of the meal, Victoria was quiet, almost contemplative. She ate her fish, drank her wine, and observed Ilara as she moved through her section, attending to other tables with quiet efficiency. When it was time for the bill, Ilara presented it in its leather folio. Victoria signed it and stood to leave. As she passed Ilara, she paused. "Vance, is it?" she asked, her voice low. "Yes, Mrs. Blackwood." Ilara finally met her gaze. Victoria's eyes were even more piercing up close, like chips of a winter sky. "You're new. You won't last." It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact, a prophecy from a woman who was used to her prophecies coming true. Then she swept out of the restaurant, leaving a wake of chilled air and palpable relief. Later, as Ilara was polishing silverware in the back, Leo came over. "I've never seen anyone do that to the soul," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "Not since the old chef, Jean-Pierre, retired. You've got guts, kid, I'll give you that. I just did my job, Leo." "No," he said, his expression serious. "You did more than that. You survived. But you also did something much more dangerous." "What's that?" "You got her attention." Leo was right. Ilara had gotten Victoria Blackwood's attention. From that night on, every Tuesday and Thursday, Victoria would request Ilara's section. It became a silent, high-stakes chess match played out over Sancerre and perfectly cooked entrees. Victoria never complimented her, but her tests became more subtle, more psychological. She would change her order at the last minute, forcing Ilara to coordinate frantically with the kitchen. She would engage Ilara in conversation, asking pointed questions that felt less like curiosity and more like interrogation. "Law school, you said, a noble pursuit for someone of your background," she remarked one evening, the slight pause before background dripping with condescension. One wonders why you'd choose a profession so reliant on finding loopholes for the guilty. "I believe it's about advocating for justice, Mrs. Blackwood." "Giving a voice to those who don't have one," Elara replied smoothly, refilling her water glass. How quaintly idealistic, Victoria scoffed, but her eyes lingered on Elara, a strange, calculating look within them. Elara learned to anticipate her moods, to read the minute tightening of her jaw or the subtle arch of an eyebrow. She remained impeccably professional, a calm, unmovable object against Victoria's unstoppable force. Yet as the weeks turned into months, Elara's sharp, observant nature began to pick up on things others missed, tiny cracks in Victoria's flawless marble facade. It started with a tremor. One night, as Victoria reached for her wine glass, Elara noticed a slight but uncontrollable shake in her hand. Victoria noticed her noticing and immediately clasped her hands in her lap, her back ramrod straight. Another time, Elara overheard a snippet of a phone call. Victoria had excused herself to the powder room, but her phone rang as she stood up. She answered it with a clipped, "What is it?" and turned away. Elara, clearing a nearby table, heard the strained whisper before Victoria moved out of earshot. "I don't care where you are, Julian. Just handle it. The press is already sniffing around the Monaco deal." Her voice wasn't angry or commanding. It was frayed thin with a desperation Elara had never heard before. The biggest clue, however, came on a rainy Tuesday in November. Victoria was late. Not by 5 or 10 minutes, but by a full half hour. This was unprecedented. The entire staff was on pins and needles. When she finally arrived, she looked disheveled. For Victoria Blackwood, this meant a single strand of hair had escaped her chignon, and her makeup was perhaps a fraction less than perfect. But on her, it was as shocking as arriving in rags. She was quiet and distracted all evening, barely touching her food. She stared out the window at the rain-streaked street, her thoughts a million miles away. Then, just as Elara was about to present the check, a sleek black town car pulled up outside. A man stepped out, a strikingly handsome man in a tailored Brioni suit, Julian Blackwood. He wasn't coming in. He opened the back door, and a young woman emerged, a leggy blonde in a dress that shimmered under the streetlights. He laughed, whispered something in her ear, and kissed her before she got into the car, and it sped away. He then got back into his own car and left in the opposite direction. Elara glanced at Victoria. She had seen it too. Her face was a mask of utter stillness, but her knuckles were white where she gripped the stem of her wine glass. She hadn't seen her husband, but she had seen the woman, the car, the intimate moment. It was a portrait of casual public betrayal. In that instant, Elara's perception of Victoria Blackwood shifted. The fear she inspired, the cruelty she wielded like a weapon, it wasn't the arrogance of a queen on her throne. It was the desperate, frantic defense of a woman, terrified of losing it. Her power wasn't innate. It was borrowed, conditional on her marriage to a man who was flaunting his infidelity on the very street outside her favorite restaurant. The armor was thick, but it was riddled with cracks. Victoria seemed to sense Elara's gaze, her moment of understanding. Her head snapped back, her eyes locking with Elara's. The cold fury returned, but this time Elara saw what lay beneath it, raw, undiluted humiliation. The check, Victoria snapped her voice, brittle. Elara brought it. As Victoria signed, her hand shook again, more noticeably this time. She scribbled her signature, threw the pen down, and stormed out of the restaurant without another word, leaving behind a half-empty glass of wine and a newfound vulnerability that hung in the air like smoke. Elara realized the game had changed. This was no longer just about a waitress and a difficult customer. It was about two women on opposite ends of the social spectrum, each beginning to see the other for who they truly were. And Elara knew, with a chilling certainty, that this newfound knowledge made her more of a threat to Victoria Blackwood than ever before. A confrontation was no longer just possible. It was inevitable. The annual Ethelgard Charity Gala was the apex of the city's social calendar, and for the first time, it was being held at the Gilded Sparrow. The restaurant was closed to the public, transformed into a glittering sea of sequins tuxedos and carefully constructed smiles. The air buzzed with the electric hum of 100 competing egos. Elara, chosen for the event staff, due to her unflappable competence, moved through the throng with a tray of champagne flutes, a silent observer to the grand performance. And at the center of it all, holding court like a Medici princess, was Victoria Blackwood. Tonight she was incandescent. She wore a midnight blue gown by Schiaparelli that seemed woven from the night sky itself, and around her neck was a river of diamonds. But her most valuable accessories were the fawning sycophants who orbited her, laughing too loudly at her dry remarks and vying for a sliver of her icy attention. Her husband Julian stood beside her, looking bored and handsome, his eyes periodically scanning the room for anyone more interesting. Elara watched the power play the subtle digs, the fake air kisses. She saw the desperation behind the smiles of women. Victoria had slighted the fear in the eyes of those who owed her favors. This was Victoria's kingdom, and tonight was her coronation. She seemed untouchable, invincible. The night wore on a blur of canapes and empty glasses. As the main course was being cleared, Victoria raised a hand to her ear, her brow furrowing. She patted her earlobe, then the side of her neck, her movements growing more frantic. "My earring," she said, her voice rising slightly, cutting through the nearby chatter. Julian turned to her, annoyed at the interruption. The women around them stopped talking, their eyes wide with morbid curiosity. "It's gone," Victoria announced, her voice now sharp with panic and accusation. "My diamond earring, the Graf diamond." A collective gasp went through her circle. Everyone knew the earrings. They were a legendary anniversary gift from Julian, rumored to be worth more than the restaurant itself. Victoria's eyes, like a hawk spotting its prey, immediately scanned the room and locked onto Elara, who was clearing plates from a nearby table. It was a moment of pure predatory calculation. Here was the waitress who had seen her weakness, who had refused to cower. Here was the perfect target to reassert her dominance, to turn her own panic into someone else's peril. "You," Victoria said, pointing a finger directly at Elara. The entire section of the room fell silent. "The waitress. You were just at my table." Elara froze, the weight of a dozen plates, suddenly feeling like a ton of bricks. "Yes, Mrs. Blackwood. I was clearing the plates. You bumped into my chair." Victoria stated, her voice hardening into a blade. "I felt it." Elara hadn't bumped into her chair. She was meticulous, graceful in her movements. It was a lie, but a brilliant one, plausible, unprovable. "I don't believe I did," Ma'am Elara said, her voice steady, despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. "Are you calling me a liar?" Victoria shot back. All pretense of civility was gone. Her face was a mask of righteous fury. "That earring was on my ear 5 minutes ago. You were the only one who came near me. I demand that you be searched and call the police." The room erupted in whispers. Julian Blackwood put a hand on his wife's arm. "Victoria, let's be reasonable." "Reasonable?" she shrieked, shaking him off. "My earring is missing, and this thief, is standing right there. Search her. She was creating a scene so large, so public, that no one would ever remember her moment of weakness by the window. They would only remember her power, her righteous rage. Mr. Dubois scurried over his face, ashen. Mrs. Blackwood, please, I'm sure there's a simple explanation. The explanation is that your staff is incompetent and criminal. All eyes were on Elara. She was trapped in the glare of 100 judgmental stares. They saw a waitress, and nobody accused by the Queen. In their world, the verdict was already in. She could feel her future law school, her reputation, everything evaporating under the heat of those lights. But then something inside her clicked. It was the law student, the analyst, the observer. Fear gave way to a cold, clear focus. Panicking was what Victoria wanted. Denying it was useless. She had to outthink her. Her mind raced, replaying every interaction she'd had with Victoria, the clothes she wore, the gestures she made. She remembered Victoria's arrival, how she had swept in, greeting her friend Catherine DeWitt. She remembered Victoria complaining about the slight chill in the room, pulling her pashmina wrap tighter around her shoulders. A beautiful deep blue cashmere wrap that perfectly matched her dress. And she remembered something Victoria had said weeks ago, a throwaway comment during one of their silent dinners. Elara took a slow, deliberate breath. She put the plates down on a nearby stand and turned to face Victoria, her expression not one of fear, but of calm, professional concern. Mrs. Blackwood Elara began her voice, projecting clearly into the stunned silence. There is no need to call the police. I believe I know where your earring is. Victoria's eyes narrowed. Oh, you do. Are you going to confess now? No, Elara said simply. She looked past Victoria to her rival Catherine DeWitt, and then to the other society women. She was now speaking to the audience, not just her accuser. Mrs. Blackwood, you mentioned earlier this evening to Mrs. DeWitt how this particular Schiaparelli gown was a nightmare to accessorize because the delicate silk weave snags on everything. Catherine DeWitt's eyes widened slightly. She nodded. She remembered the conversation. Elara continued her gaze, moving to the wrap draped over Victoria's chair. And I recall you mentioning on a previous occasion that the cashmere of your favorite wrap, while exquisite, has a loose weave that catches on your jewelry. Victoria's face, which had been a mask of triumph, began to show the first flicker of uncertainty. Where was this going? Elara took a step forward, her voice gentle but firm. You said you felt a bump. Perhaps it wasn't me. Perhaps it was the earring itself snagging as you adjusted your wrap when you first felt the chill. She looked directly into Victoria's eyes. With all due respect, Mrs. Blackwood, before you have me arrested, perhaps you should check the cuff of your own pashmina. The silence in the room was absolute, profound. It was a dare. A quiet, polite, but devastatingly public dare. Victoria was trapped. To refuse would be to admit the possibility of being wrong. To accept was to play into the waitress's hands. For a tense second, she stared at Elara with pure hatred. Then, with a jerky, angry movement, she snatched the wrap from her chair. Her perfectly manicured fingers ran along the edge of the cuff, and then they stopped. Her eyes went wide. Dangling from a single delicate cashmere thread, winking under the crystal chandeliers, was the Graf diamond earring. The sound that followed was worse than shouting. It was a collective, stifled intake of breath from everyone watching. It was the ghost of a laugh, quickly smothered from Catherine DeWitt. It was the dead, echoing silence where applause and admiration for Victoria had been only moments before. Victoria Blackwood, the untouchable queen of society, stood in the middle of her own gala, having accused an innocent waitress of theft, only to be revealed as a forgetful, flustered woman. She hadn't been robbed. She'd been clumsy. She hadn't been powerful. She'd been foolish. Elara didn't say a word. She didn't have to. She simply stood there, her calm demeanor, a mirror reflecting Victoria's own absurdity. In her attempt to ruin the waitress, Victoria Blackwood had done the one thing she feared most. She had made herself look utterly, completely ridiculous. The immediate aftermath was a tableau of exquisite social awkwardness. Victoria Blackwood stood frozen, the diamond earring a glittering accusation in her hand. Her face, a canvas of fury and humiliation, was chalk white. Julian Blackwood, for his part, looked at his wife with an expression of pure, unadulterated annoyance, as if she were a business deal that had just gone sour in a very public way. He stepped forward, his voice a low growl intended only for her. "Fix this, Victoria. Now." She snatched the earring from the thread, shoved it onto her earlobe, and without a single glance at Elara, turned and walked stiffly towards the exit, her husband trailing in her wake. Her departure was not the grand, sweeping exit of a queen, but the hurried, head-down retreat of a disgraced courtier. The gala, for all intents and purposes, was over. The spell was broken. Elara stood by the table, her legs suddenly feeling weak. The adrenaline began to recede, leaving a shaky emptiness in its place. Mr. Dubois rushed to her side, his face a mixture of terror and awe. "Vance! I don't know what to say," he stammered. "I was just doing my job," Elara said quietly, though she knew it was more than that. She had defended herself, yes, but she had also toppled a tyrant with nothing but a well-placed observation. She fully expected to hear the words, "You're fired." It was the path of least resistance. Placate the Blackwoods, sacrifice the waitress. But the next day, the call from Mr. Dubois never came. Instead, something strange happened. The restaurant's reservation line began ringing off the hook. The story of the gala had ripped through Ethelgard Heights society like a wildfire. Everyone wanted to book a table at the Gilded Sparrow, and they all had the same quiet request. They wanted to be seated in the section of that waitress, the one who stood up to Victoria Blackwood. Elara had become a local folk hero. When she arrived for her shift on Saturday, Leo greeted her with a slow, impressed grin. "They're calling you the Dragon Slayer." "In the kitchen," he said, handing her a fresh apron. Catherine DeWitt came for lunch, tipped $200 on a $60 bill, left a note that said, "For services rendered to the community." Elara felt a strange mix of relief and unease. She hadn't sought fame or notoriety. She had just defended herself. But in a world built on a fragile ecosystem of fear, her act of quiet courage was a seismic event. She had shown everyone that the Empress had no clothes, and they were reveling in it. The real aftershock came a week later. It was a quiet Tuesday night. Victoria Blackwood's corner booth sat conspicuously empty, a void in the dining room that spoke volumes. Just as the evening service was winding down, the heavy oak doors opened. It was Julian Blackwood. Alone. He wasn't dressed for dinner but wore a dark, perfectly tailored business suit. He moved with an athlete's grace and a predator's confidence, his eyes scanning the room until they found Elara. The host, Marcus, practically tripped over himself to greet him. "Mr. Blackwood, what a surprise, a table for you, no?" Julian said, his deep voice silencing all nearby conversation. His eyes never left Elara. "I'm here to see her." Mr. Dubois appeared from his office, his face pale. "Mr. Blackwood, if this is about the other night, I assure you we are handling the personnel issue." Julian waved a dismissive hand, not even bothering to look at the manager. "Leave us." It was a command. not a request. Dubois and Marcus evaporated. Julian Blackwood walked directly to the empty service station where Ilara was polishing wine glasses. He leaned against the counter, creating a bubble of intimidating silence around them. Ilara's heart hammered in her chest. This was it. The other shoe was about to drop. The wife had failed, so they had sent the king. "Ilara Vance," he said. "It wasn't a question. I've been hearing a lot about you." "I'm sure you have, Mr. Blackwood," she replied, forcing her voice to remain level. She continued polishing the glass, her hands a study in controlled calm. He watched her for a moment, a faint, unreadable smile on his lips. "My wife has a flair for the dramatic," he said, the understatement hanging in the air. "She builds her world on the idea that everyone is breakable. She prides herself on finding the fracture point and applying pressure." He paused, leaning in slightly. "What I can't figure out," he continued, his voice dropping lower, "is you. She applied all the pressure she had. She tried to ruin you in front of 100 of the most influential people in this city. And you didn't just not break. You dismantled her." Ilara stopped polishing. She placed the glass carefully on the mat and finally met his gaze. His eyes were a startlingly dark blue, shrewd and analytical. "I didn't dismantle your wife, Mr. Blackwood. I just told the truth. Her own actions did the rest." A genuine laugh escaped him, a short, sharp bark of amusement and surprise. "The truth," he repeated, as if tasting a foreign word. "A rare commodity. Especially in my world." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a slim, expensive-looking envelope. He slid it across the counter to her. "I don't know what your ambitions are, Miss Vance," he said, his voice all business now. "But people who can think clearly under that kind of pressure are valuable. People who aren't afraid of my wife are unicorns." He pushed himself off the counter. "Whatever happens next, that was a hell of a performance. You have my respect." And with that, he turned and walked out, leaving the envelope and a stunned Ilara in his wake. Her hands trembling slightly, she picked it up. It wasn't sealed. Inside was not a threat, not a lawsuit, but a simple, crisp business card. Julian Blackwood, CEO, Blackwood Holdings. On the back, a single sentence was handwritten in sharp, decisive ink. "If you ever decide law is too boring, call me." Ilara stared at the card, her mind reeling. This wasn't the ending she had expected. She had prepared for a war, but she had somehow walked into a job interview. She had faced the dragon, and instead of being burned, had captured the attention of the man who owned the entire mountain. The game had become infinitely more complicated and infinitely more dangerous. Victoria Blackwood vanished. She was not seen at the Gilded Sparrow. Her name disappeared from the society columns. Rumors swirled like autumn leaves in a storm. Some said she'd gone to a private wellness retreat in Switzerland. Others whispered that Julian had finally exiled her to their Hamptons estate. The truth was, no one knew. Her throne at Table 1 remained empty, a silent monument to her public fall from grace. In her absence, the atmosphere at the restaurant transformed. The oppressive tension was gone, replaced by a lighter, more relaxed energy. The staff joked more freely. Patrons laughed without checking over their shoulders. It was as if a perpetual storm cloud had finally drifted away. Ilara, however, couldn't shake a feeling of profound unease. The encounter with Julian Blackwood had left her deeply unsettled. His offer, or whatever it was, felt less like an opportunity, and more like another, more sophisticated kind of test. She tucked his card into her law textbook and tried to forget about it, focusing instead on her impending final exams. But the ghost of Victoria Blackwood lingered. Ilara found herself thinking about the tremor in her hand, the flicker of desperation in her eyes when she saw her husband's infidelity. The more she thought about it, the less Victoria seemed like a monster, and the more she seemed like a tragic, deeply flawed character in a play not entirely of her own writing. Her curiosity, the same instinct that drove her toward law, got the better of her. She started to dig, not in a malicious way, but in a quest for understanding. She used her university's digital newspaper archives, searching for the name Victoria Blackwood. What she found wasn't the polished society queen, but a different woman entirely. Victoria's maiden name was Victoria Nowak. She hadn't been born into wealth. Her father was a Polish immigrant, a steel worker from the industrial side of town. Her mother was a seamstress. Victoria had been brilliant, a scholarship kid who fought her way into an Ivy League school. The articles from her university days painted a picture of a fiercely ambitious, intelligent woman, the president of the debate club, a magna cum laude graduate in art history. Then, about a year after graduation, the articles changed. She appeared on the arm of Julian Blackwood, a rising star in real estate, 20 years her senior. The society pages from that era described her as his stunning and whip-smart fiancée. The transformation had begun. Victoria Nowak, the steelworker's daughter, was slowly erased, replaced by Victoria Blackwood, the society icon. Leo filled in some of the blanks. One slow night as they were closing up, Ilara asked him about it. "I remember when she first started coming here with him," Leo said, leaning against the bar. 20 years ago. She was different then, quieter. You could see she was smart as a whip, but she was always watching, learning. She had this hunger in her eyes, the hunger of someone who's been on the outside and is terrified of ever going back. He sighed, polishing the bar top with a soft cloth. Julian didn't just marry her, he forged her. He needed a wife who could be a social weapon, someone beautiful enough to be a trophy, but ruthless enough to protect his social flank, to host the parties, to intimidate the rivals, to keep the vultures at bay while he built his empire. He taught her that in their world, kindness is weakness, and fear is a tool. She was a brilliant student. The pieces clicked into place for Ilara. The cruelty wasn't her nature, it was her job. The icy demeanor was a uniform. The public takedowns were key performance indicators. She wasn't just a millionaire's wife. She was an employee in a gilded cage, and her position was perpetually insecure. The tremor in her hand wasn't just a sign of stress. It was the fatigue of a soldier who had been fighting on a battlefield for 2 decades. The affair Ilara had witnessed wasn't just a betrayal. It was a reminder that her contract could be terminated at any time. The public humiliation at the gala hadn't just been embarrassing. It had been a catastrophic professional failure. She had failed to maintain the aura of untouchable power that was her primary function. Ilara felt a strange, unwelcome pang of empathy. It wasn't pity, but a lawyer's understanding of circumstance. She saw the mitigating factors, the long, slow series of choices and pressures that had hammered a brilliant young woman into a bitter, fearsome shell. She had won the battle at the gala, but she was beginning to understand the true nature of the war Victoria had been fighting her entire adult life. One rainy Thursday, nearly 2 months after the gala, Ilara was setting tables for the evening service. She looked over at table 1 now, just another table, no longer a throne. She imagined a young Victoria Nowak sitting there wide-eyed and terrified, learning the brutal rules of a game she had to master in order to survive. Her thoughts were interrupted by the squeak of the front door. A woman stood there silhouetted against the grey evening light. She wore a simple trench coat and held a scarf over the lower half of her face. It wasn't until she stepped into the light and lowered the scarf that Elara recognized her. It was Victoria Blackwood. But it was a version of her Elara had never seen. Her hair was down, falling softly around her shoulders. She wore no makeup, no jewelry. The severe architectural lines of her face had softened, revealing a woman who looked tired, fragile, and her age. The dragon was gone. In her place was just a woman standing alone in the rain. Her eyes found Elara's across the empty dining room, and she took a hesitant step inside. The rainy Thursday evening service was approaching. 2 months had passed since the gala, and the Gilded Sparrow had settled into a new, calmer rhythm. The corner booth, once a source of ambient dread, was now just table 1, a desirable spot requested for its view, not for its proximity to power. Elara was meticulously arranging the silverware on its starched white linen, the familiar motions a comforting balm. She often found herself looking at that table, thinking of it less as a throne and more as a gilded prison cell, a thought that would have been unimaginable just a few months prior. The ghost of Victoria Blackwood was no longer a dragon to be feared, but a puzzle she had started to, if not solve, then at least understand. The heavy oak door creaked open, letting in a gust of damp, cold air that smelled of wet pavement and fallen leaves. A lone figure stood silhouetted against the bleak evening light, hesitant on the threshold. Leo, polishing glasses at the bar, glanced up and squinted. Marcus, the host, took a half step forward, his professional smile ready before it faltered in confusion. It was a woman, but she carried none of the confident entitlement of their usual clientele. She lowered the scarf from her face as she stepped into the warmer light of the dining room. Elara froze a silver fork held mid-air. It was Victoria Blackwood. But it was a version of her that was profoundly, shockingly different. The severe architectural chignon was gone, replaced by dark hair that fell unstyled around her shoulders, framing a face stripped of its cosmetic armor. Without the sharp lines of eyeliner and the bold slash of red lipstick, her features seemed softer, vulnerable. She wore a simple camel trench coat, practical rather than declarative, and beneath it plain black trousers and a cashmere sweater. She looked like a professor or an art gallery curator. She looked tired. The formidable queen had abdicated, and in her place stood only a woman. Her eyes no longer chips of ice, but pools of deep, weary blue scanned the empty room, and found Elara. She walked forward, her steps measured and quiet, the confident gliding stride replaced by a grounded human gait. She stopped a few tables away from Elara, clutching her handbag to her chest as if it were a life raft. The few staff members in the room watched silent and rapt, sensing this was not a prelude to a storm, but a postscript. "Hello, Elara," Victoria said. The use of her first name was more disarming than any command she had ever issued. Her voice was lower, lacking its customary resonant authority. "They told me you still worked here." Elara placed the fork down with deliberate care, her mind racing. She straightened up her posture professional by instinct. "Yes, Mrs. Blackwood." A quick, bitter smile flickered across Victoria's face. "Please, don't call me that. That woman, she no longer exists. It's just Victoria now." The statement was delivered with a strange finality, the closing of a book. "I'm not here to cause a scene." She continued her gaze, drifting past Elara to the window, to the rain blurring the lights of the city. I needed to understand something." She turned her full attention back to Elara, her expression one of genuine, painful curiosity. That night, at the gala, everyone in that room was afraid of me. It's how I controlled things. It's how I survived. But you weren't. Why, it was the question that had clearly gnawed at her, the anomaly she could not compute. Her entire operational theory of the world had been proven false by a single waitress, and she had returned to the scene of the experiment to understand why. Elara took a breath, considering the woman before her. This wasn't a trap. It was a genuine inquiry from a soul in exile. I was afraid Elara confessed, her voice quiet but firm. I was terrified. You have the power to ruin people. I've seen you do it. But you were trying to take more than my job that night. You were trying to take my future, my name. My fear of losing that was greater than my fear of you. Victoria stared at her, processing the logic. It was as if Elara were speaking a language she once knew, but had long forgotten. My future, she repeated softly. I used to think about that. She gave a hollow laugh. This place, this whole life. I fought tooth and nail to get in, and then I spent 20 years fighting every single day just to stay. I studied my husband, his rivals, his friends. I learned that fear was their currency, so I became the master of it. I built walls so high and so thick that no one could touch me. Her eyes glossed with a profound ancient sadness. I became a dragon, Elara, guarding a hoard of treasure. I was so busy breathing fire at anyone who came near, I forgot I was also locked inside the cave. I was in a cage. She reached into her handbag and pulled out a long cream-colored envelope. It was from a private bank, not one of the corporate monoliths bearing the Blackwood name. She placed it on the table between them. I heard you were saving for law school, Victoria said, her tone shifting, becoming more direct. I made some inquiries. I found out the precise balance of your outstanding tuition. Elara's eyes fell to the thick envelope. A cashier's check. The weight of its meaning was immense. It was conscience money. It was a surrender. I can't accept this, Elara said immediately, instinctively. Why not? Victoria's voice sharpened, a ghost of her old self returning. Is your pride worth more than your dream? Don't be a fool. Pride is a luxury for people who have everything else. I had it. It's worthless. This isn't about pride, Elara countered, meeting her gaze. My education can't be a transaction that erases what happened. Erase it. Victoria's expression was stark. Nothing can erase it. This isn't for you, Elara. Not really. It's for me. This is the first significant decision I've made in 20 years that wasn't approved, dictated, or influenced by Julian. It's the first thing I've done as me. As Victoria Nowak. Don't take that away from me. She pushed the envelope an inch closer. Think of it as severance. For services rendered. You held up a mirror to a monster, and you were the only one brave enough not to look away. That was a very effective, if brutal, consultation. She took a step back, preparing to leave. I'm no longer Mrs. Blackwood. The divorce is being finalized. He respects strength, you see. You showed it, and in doing so, you showed him I had lost mine. When a queen is publicly checkmated, the king simply finds a new player. Her delivery was cold, clinical, the language of a hostile takeover. She turned and walked toward the door. Take the money, Elara Vance, she said, her voice carrying across the silent room. Finish your school. Become the kind of lawyer who gives men like Julian Blackwood sleepless nights. Don't let their world corrupt you. It's a cancer. And then she was gone, disappearing back into the rainy evening she had emerged from, leaving behind an envelope and the palpable echo of a life dismantled. Elara stood motionless, the quiet hum of the restaurant returning to her ears. Leo approached her side softly. Is that? Yes, Elara whispered. She looked from the check on the table to Leo's kind, weary face. She thought of Julian Blackwood's business card, a temptation of power still tucked in her textbook. It represented one path joining the game, playing by their corrupt rules. And here on the table was another path, funded by the wreckage of that world, but leading somewhere else entirely. It was a choice between becoming a king or becoming a shield for those the kings would crush. With a newfound clarity, she picked up the check. The paper felt heavy like a key. She folded it and placed it securely in her pocket. Then she walked to the staff room, untied the strings of her apron for the very last time, and left it neatly folded on the bench. Her time as a waitress was over. Her education had just been paid for, but her real learning she knew was just beginning. That is the story of Alara Vance and Victoria Blackwood, a story that proves that true power isn't about the fear you can inspire, but the courage you can find within yourself. It's a reminder that behind every fearsome facade, there's a human story, often one of pain and desperation. We've all encountered a Victoria in our lives, someone whose power seems absolute. And we've all felt like Alara, feeling small and overlooked. But courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's the quiet voice at the end of the day that says, "I will try again tomorrow." Or in Alara's case, a calm, steady voice that dares to speak the truth in a room full of lies. If this story of unexpected strength and hidden truths resonated with you, please show your support by hitting that like button, sharing it with someone who might need a reminder of their own power, and subscribing for more real-life stories that explore the complexities of the human heart. And let me know in the comments, what would you have done in Alara's place?